Hello and welcome to this episode of the Context Mini Psychology School. My name is Catherine Walshe and I'm a doctoral researcher investigating the barriers and facilitators to accessing sexual assault services in Ireland. This episode reflects my area of study by looking at sexual violence as it exists in the context of the country of Ireland. For a long time, Roman Catholic ideology has governed Irish life. The Catholic Church behaved as an everyday moral compass, with most deferring to it for guidance across many aspects of life. Perhaps the most influence exerted by the Catholic Church was on society's sexual morality. The presence of the Church was felt within marriages where for a long time divorce was illegal. The Church was present in the bedroom where contraceptives were banned by law, reflecting the conservative Catholic view of sex as existing solely for procreation. Catholic teachings on mores that were instilled in the Irish psyche ensured women and men adhered to rigid gender roles. In the workplace, a marriage bar existed. Though now considered a sexist and discriminatory practice, the marriage bar prevented women working in the civil service upon getting married, so they could instead focus on their new job of wife and mother. The Church had an explicit role through its influence on legislation and healthcare, as well as education, through state-run educational institutions and Magdalene laundries. Initially designed to minimize the number of sex workers on the streets, Magdalene laundries were set up in Ireland to house women ostracized by both their families and society for being single mothers. These facets of society were inextricably linked to the Church. Abuse was rife in these institutions, and a report published in 2009 uncovered the sexual, emotional, and physical abuse perpetrated in Magdalene laundries and other educational institutions. A subsequent report investigating allegations of sexual abuse perpetrated by Catholic priests against young boys concluded that complaints against priests were covered up, with the protection of priests and the reputation of the Church being of paramount importance. Similar subsequent reports conducted around Ireland exposed the human rights infringements experienced by children. Because of these revelations, the influence of the Church was ebbing away. Ireland was becoming more secularized, moving away from the control of the Catholic Church. Another significant reason for this was the emergence of feminism. Through their relentless campaigning and advocating, feminists have been instrumental in securing progressive changes in Irish society. For example, in the 1970s, members of the Irish women's liberation movement travelled to Northern Ireland, where contraceptives were legal, to procure them and introduce them into the Republic. This event was significant as laws on contraception were subsequently loosened as a consequence of this protest. Demonstrations of secularization continued in society. The marriage bar was removed and divorce was legalized. Over 20 years after decriminalizing homosexuality, Ireland became the first country to legalize gay marriage by popular vote in 2015. Perhaps one of the last vestiges of the Church was removed with the repealing of a law that rendered abortion illegal in Ireland. Considered a human rights violation by many, the right to life of the unborn was equal to that of the mother. A contentious issue in Ireland for decades, constitutional reform in 2018 granted people access to abortion. Led by feminists, it was considered a huge victory for women's rights that secured bodily autonomy for women. Ireland's departure from continued deference to the Catholic Church is perhaps best illustrated by the recent papal visit to Ireland in 2018. Compared to the previous papal visit in 1979, only 125,000 people arrived to see the Pope in Dublin's Phoenix Park, a stark contrast to the almost 1 million people who turned up to the same event nearly 40 years previously. Despite progression in society, particularly around sex and gender, sexual violence, a gendered issue which disproportionately affects women, is still very present in Irish society. The World Health Organization defines sexual violence as any act attempts to obtain a sexual act or acts to traffic for sexual purposes directed against a person using coercion, harassment, or advances made by any person regardless of their relationship to the victim in any setting, including but not limited to work and home. Crime figures show that sexual violence is increasing worldwide. In the USA, rates have risen from 1.4 to 2.7 per 1,000 people over 12 years of age between 2017 and 2018. In the UK, the number of sexual offences recorded by the police has increased by 3% between 2018 and 2019. And in Ireland, the number of sexual offences recorded increased by 10.8% between 2017 and 2018. The most recent population-based research on sexual violence in Ireland comes from the Sexual Abuse and Violence in Ireland report, published in 2002. With just over 3,000 participants across Ireland, it found that 1 in 5 women reported experiencing contact sexual assault as adults. The same was true for 1 in 10 men. Across the lifespan, 28% of men experienced some form of sexual abuse or assault, with 42% of women experiencing the same. 1/4 of women and 1 in 6 men reported having experienced symptoms consistent with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder at some time in their lives following and as a direct consequence of their experience of sexual violence. Approximately 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men reported that their experience of sexual violence, either in childhood, adulthood, or both, had had a moderate or extreme effect on their lives overall. Indeed, the impact of sexual violence can be profound. It has been described as the most severe of all traumas due to the outcomes incurred by the victim, including multiple psychological and psychosocial sequelae. There is an increased risk of developing mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, PTSD, as well as alcohol and drug-related issues. The experience of sexual violence is also associated with increased risk of suicidal behavior and has been implicated as a risk factor for the development of psychiatric disorders. A range of other somatic responses, including sleep difficulty, nightmares, and disrupted eating patterns, have also been observed. Despite these impacts, both individual and societal, victims of sexual violence seek help at typically low rates. There is a large attrition rate in cases of sexual violence. Attrition is defined as the process in which rape cases are discontinued and fail to reach a conviction. In 2009, Lovett and Kelly tracked attrition rates in rape cases across Europe, including Ireland. Of 100 cases, 18 were charged and 16 went before a court of law. 8 of these 16 were convicted, establishing an 8% conviction rate in Ireland. Indeed, attrition can begin as early as when a victim decides not to report their experience to law enforcement agencies. As we will see, there are multiple significant barriers to help seeking for victims of sexual violence. There exists a large set of cultural beliefs that support and help perpetuate sexual violence. These cultural beliefs or myths promote the idea that the victim is to blame for their assault. Internalization of these beliefs, that is to say, accepting and absorbing these beliefs, leads to self-blame, guilt, and shame for victims. If a victim is having these thoughts about themselves, it is not unrealistic for them to expect and fear that others will blame them too, making it difficult to disclose and seek help. Indeed, this often is the case. If a victim chooses to disclose what has happened to them, it is usually to an informal source, such as friends or family. However, victims, friends, and family are usually living in the same society and have often internalized the same beliefs as the victim. As a result, negative reactions to disclosures are common for victims. Negative reactions include blaming the victim by asking questions such as, "What were you wearing?" or "How much did you drink?" An adherence to rape myths was demonstrated among 40% of respondents of the Savvy report, who agreed with the statement, "Accusations of rape are often false," and a further 29% who agreed with the statement, "Women who wear short skirts or tight tops are inviting rape." The impact of negative reactions on victims' psychological distress and likelihood to seek further help is huge. Negative social reactions are related to more psychological symptoms and can discourage further help seeking or disclosures. Victims are just as vulnerable to receiving these victim-blaming responses from service providers, including medical and legal support services. Post-assault help seeking from formal systems can become a second rape, as the trauma of service providers' responses to a victim's disclosure mimics that of the original assault, particularly if they are met with disbelief or behaviors and attitudes that are victim-blaming, which only serve to further traumatize the victim. A reaction to the occurrence of rape and sexual violence in Ireland, feminists in Dublin were eager to establish Ireland's first rape crisis centre. Since opening its doors in 1979, the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre has seen a steady increase in the number of people accessing the service, from 70 contacts in year one to 13,367 in 2018. Research suggests that the earlier professional help is sought, the better the outcomes for the individual. Rape crisis services provide interventions such as counselling and psychotherapy to victims of sexual assault. Importantly, staff at rape crisis centres are specifically trained and specialise in dealing with victims of sexual assault and are aware of the vulnerabilities of this group and the potential harm of victim-blaming treatment that can result in this second rape. Services provided by rape crisis centres, including helplines, advocacy and counselling, were found to be supportive and informative by service users. Rape crisis centres provide other services to victims, including medical accompaniment, and assist victims in the legal process should they go down that route, including court accompaniment. This can often be a distressing process for victims during which they are particularly vulnerable to experiencing this second rape as a result of disbelieving or insensitive responses from service providers. Again, research has found that survivors who engage with rape crisis advocates during their interactions with medical and legal personnel are less likely to experience the second rape and have more positive experiences in these interactions. The Dublin Rape Crisis Centre is also working to improve Ireland's legal and justice systems so that they deliver effective support to survivors of sexual violence. They contribute to and advocate for legislative and policy changes and improvement to better serve survivors of sexual violence so that they get the support and justice they deserve. Changes currently being advocated for include the need for training for all practitioners and professionals who come in contact with victims of sexual crime, including specific training in interviewing, investigating, forensics, and prosecution. Improved research and data collection of the prevalence and trends of sexual violence is also being campaigned for. Pressure on the Irish government, coming from advocacy agencies such as the Rape Crisis Centres, is affecting real change in Ireland. We saw this campaigning coming to fruition with the recent announcement that the government will be conducting a second Savvy report, 17 years after the first. This national survey on the prevalence of sexual violence in Ireland will now be carried out every 10 years. Similarly, the new Domestic Violence Act 2018 also came into force, which, among other enhanced protections, makes coercive control a criminal offence for the first time. Ireland also recently updated their sexual offence laws to include the legal definition of consent, and lists the circumstances in which consent cannot be given, for example, being asleep or unconscious. Social media has been a significant vehicle of change in the fight against sexual violence. According to a recent Rape Crisis Centre report, its counsellors have never been as busy since the beginning of the Me Too movement. The movement, along with other similar social media movements, has provided a space for people to disclose their experience. It has opened up a dialogue on sexual violence that hasn't existed previously. This is important as disclosing sexual violence acts as a deterrent for perpetrating. Perpetrators can no longer rely on the silence of victims. Social media has been central to facilitating disclosure and removing some of the taboo surrounding sexual violence. The hashtag #MeToo began as a retaliation against the constant sexual violence experienced by women in society. The magnitude of the problem was evidenced by the millions who shared the hashtag. Irish people's attitudes to sexual violence are changing. Sexual violence is becoming less tolerated. This change was demonstrated recently in the aftermath of a pivotal court case known as the Belfast Rape Trial, in which the accused were acquitted of rape despite considerable evidence. This resulted in unprecedented public outcry and created a national discourse on our attitudes to rape and sexual violence in society. The result of the court case inspired rallies and protests decrying society's tolerance of gender-based violence. It seems Irish society is moving in a new direction, particularly in its attitudes towards women and sexual violence. Ireland has come a long way, considering that up until 1981, rape was once considered a property crime, whereby a man could sue another man for raping his wife. However, gender inequality still exists in Ireland as it does in many parts of the world. Women continue to be disproportionately affected by sexual violence, glass ceilings, and pay gaps. Research has found that people are more likely to categorize others on the basis of gender than on the basis of race, age, or role, making sexism one of the most important forms of discrimination to study. Fortunately, Ireland is experiencing somewhat of a gender revolution by raising the status of women one referendum at a time. Thank you for listening to this episode of Context Mini Psychology Schools. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to find out more about Context, you can visit our website at psychotraumanetwork.com. I'd also like to thank the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme, without which Context would not be possible. Thank you for listening.